Nancy, welcome to the Tenement Museum.
Thank you.
I found your book, One Quarter of the Nation, particularly fascinating because I am part of that 1/4 of the nation. I came to Jackson Heights from Bombay when I was 14, and my family had couches much like this, covered in plastic to keep them looking new. But your book, revealed so much about, we changed when we came to America. We changed our accents, we changed the way we dressed and behaved and what we ate and the kind of culture we consumed. Mm-hmm. But your book showed me all the ways in which we immigrants have changed America, and I found it really eye-opening and unlike really any of the other books I've read about immigration. So can you talk a bit about what made you write this book and choose this particular track and the main topics that you focused on?
Okay, thanks. Why did I picked it exactly for the reason actually that you just said. Because most of the literature, I'm a social scientist, a sociologist, and most of the academic literature on immigration in the United States does focus on what happens to immigrants when they get here, how they change, and how their children change, and how, and in fact, that's what my previous work did. I like others, worked on integration, on how people adjusted and adapted to life in America. But what was missing from the literature is what happens when immigrants come here to America, to the country. And I also wanted to get a sort of big picture view, not just focus on New York, much as I love New York, and as I'm a New Yorker as well, but to go beyond, not just look at New York, but to look at the country as a whole. And it's really incredible. I mean, the numbers are just astounding. So let me just say a little bit about the numbers. I mean, it's called 1/4 of the nation because that's immigrants and their children now are 86 million people. And to put that in perspective, that is a little more than the population of Germany. I mean, and it's an enormous number. Immigrants alone are 45 million people. So, and this has been a big change. I focus in the book on the post-1965 period. And the reason for the 1965 is because that's the year in which a new law was passed by Congress, really changing, or I might even say revolutionizing, the American immigration system. Because in the 1920s, congressional legislation enacted national origins quotas, which severely limited immigration, particularly from almost everywhere except Northern and Western Europe. Then most people couldn't get here, couldn't come here. And those national origins quotas were eliminated in 1965, opening up the country, making it possible for immigrants to come from other countries. And we see the figures just going up. And just to give an idea, in 1960, there were a little under 10 million immigrants in the US. Now there are 45 million. In 1960, 5% of the country were foreign born. Now it's 14%, which is almost as high as 1910 and 1890, which were the peak years the peak periods of immigration. So the numbers have changed. The source countries have changed. It used to be in 1960, just to give some more figures, I know, but I do think they sort of give a sense of what the changes are. 75% of immigrants in 1960 were European. Today, Europeans are 10% of immigrants. Immigrants from Latin America and the Caribbean are about half, about a quarter or more now are Asian. Even Africans are 5%. So there's been a huge change. And so the question is, how do these huge numbers and the change in source countries and regions, how has that affected this country? Well, it has affected this country in a lot of ways. And so what I wanted to do was to really show that and show what's been happening as a result of immigration in this recent period. And also I talk a lot about history because this is not a new immigration. We've always had immigration, and we've had many periods of large-scale immigration, and immigrants have always been changing America. They're a very important source of change. And so I look in the book, and we can talk more about how immigrants have changed the composition of the racial composition of the country, ideas about race, how they've changed electoral politics, how they've changed popular culture, how they've changed cities and communities throughout the country, how they've changed the economy, and not just changed it, revitalized the economy, and as well many communities around the country. So that's sort of that was my aim in doing the book, and a bit about how I went about it.
So you have a chapter devoted to race, and there's been a huge national conversation about whiteness and blackness, and what these terms mean. And the perspective you bring to bear is that immigration has changed those conceptions. So could you elaborate a bit on that?
Again, I just want to maybe set the stage for the figures again, because I think that does help show it. Again, I picked 1960 because that's the census year before the 1965 bill. In 1960, there were 85% of Americans were non-Hispanic white. It's now 60%. Hispanics were 3.5%. They're now 19%. They've become the largest minority group, largely to immigration, but also to fertility. Asians were practically invisible in 1960. They were less than 1%. They're now 6%. Black population was very similar in percentage, but now 1 out of 10 blacks are immigrants. So it's not just the composition of the population, obviously, as Suketu was saying. It's as you were saying, it's the perceptions of race.
Yeah.
And so the category Hispanic was invented in a way. I mean, that became an enumeration category in the census in 1980. Asians have gone. Asians were barred from immigration. They were not allowed. Asian immigrants couldn't become citizens. There was a notion of the yellow peril. Most Asians were Chinese. Of course, the Japanese were put in internment camps during World War II. Now they're, not to say that prejudice against Asian Americans has disappeared, it has not, but they're referred to often as a model minority. Whites now they feel that their privileges their white privileges, they're very concerned about, and certainly politicians increase this concern, that they're becoming a minority. And they're not a minority, but that they're becoming a minority, that they are, that immigrants and other minorities are getting ahead of them, and that they're falling behind, and that that immigrants are cutting in line. So that there are a lot of fears among whites about things that they took for granted before, that they can't. And I think in many parts of the country, in terms of blacks, and I say blacks because I don't like African Americans, so many of people who are seen as black are not African American. They're immigrants or children of immigrants. I mean, that's been a change. And it's particularly visible. It's not visible everywhere in the country. But certainly in New York and Miami, which are the leading centers, places where black immigrants have gone to settle, but also in places like Minneapolis, where there's a huge East African community, or Lewiston, Maine, where there's a huge East African community. I think many people, black people, those who are black, but also those who are not, are more sensitive to national origin differences and ethnic differences among those who are labeled black. So I think that's a change too.
Yeah, you write that in New York, there's research that shows that white employers prefer West Indian immigrants over native blacks for lower-level service jobs, and also in Ivy League admissions, there's a differential. So, so how does this play out with things like affirmative action, or because you also point out that even if you might be Nigerian or Jamaican, when you're in the country, when you're walking on the street, people still look at you as black, and you still are subject to the same kind of discrimination as African Americans.
How does it play? Well, one issue, is that certainly many Africans, Nigerians being a prominent case, and many from the West Indies, they're very positively selected, and so they come from backgrounds with parents with a fair level of education. Nigerians are one of the most highly educated groups in the country, a very high level. I think it's over 60% of Nigerian immigrants have a college degree or more. So they come with advantages, and they are way overrepresented certainly in colleges and universities compared to African Americans. So that is, I mean, so I guess you could say that maybe when in colleges, if you're in a college and university, you also may become more sensitive to ethnic differences among the black population, because those blacks that you're interacting with, either themselves or their parents, may be from abroad. Yeah, so I think that's.
So when most Americans think of immigrants or the immigrant centers, they think of New York and all these movies about the gorgeous mosaic, and what they don't think of is a place where I recently bought a house, which is rural North Carolina, and I now spent some of my time in rural North Carolina, and I moved from New York, and I was astounded to find that in the place where I live, which is mostly white, there is down the road a group of Tamils from South India who are putting up a 168-foot golden statue of a Hindu god, Murugan. And across from the golden god is coming up a Vietnamese electric car manufacturing facility. And there is a strip mall where I can get excellent Iraqi bread next to a Sichuan restaurant, next to a Nepalese momo place. And this is in North Carolina. So your book shows that these immigrants are all around the nation, not just in the big cities.
That's actually a big change. I mean, I think and actually when you talk about North Carolina, I think this is the first time there's been such huge immigration to the South.
Right.
I mean, the South, after all, had its own labor force, right, of people who's had their origins in slavery. But there's been a huge immigration to the South, both into southern cities and into rural areas, and the same in parts of the Midwest that haven't seen immigration in a very long time, and the same with parts of the West. So that there has been this big dispersion, yes, and so it's been an enormous change. Where you're talking about the Asian immigrants or Asian Americans in North Carolina, the group that's actually, because it's such a larger group that you find in many rural areas, are Hispanics, in very small towns. In the West, in the Midwest, in the South, and many of them have been drawn by work there. I mean, meat processing plants being one of the major ones, because meat processing plants left urban areas partly in search of cheap labor, and went to the small towns, towns that have 4,000, 5,000 people in them. And they have played a big role in reviving these places, because they were losing population, and very seriously losing population, and they have reduced population loss, and actually demographers show that in some places have actually increased population. So yeah, it's all, immigrants are really everywhere. Again, I have to give just one figure again. I have to, from Dallas. I find some of these figures I study this, and then I look at these figures and I say, can that be right? And this is about Dallas-Fort Worth, which in 1970 had 35,000 immigrants. And by 2014, it had 1.2 million. And by the way, that's a place that has a lot of Asian immigrants, and including a lot of Indian immigrants, well off in some of the suburbs. And so, that's kind of incredible. I mean, Raleigh had the immigrant population increased by 1,000% in 20 years. The numbers are still relatively small, but Asian Americans and Hispanics are now about 15% of the city of Raleigh. That's a city that was only black and white.
Right.
So that's a really, this is very significant changes.
So the city of Raleigh is very close to me, because my sister lives there, and my brother-in-law is the first Indian American state senator in North Carolina history. And when he got elected in 2016, and when he told me he was going to run for state senate, I said, in the South? Are you kidding? But he won in a landslide, and he's now the Democratic whip in the state senate. And So
Well, of course, the South has Bobby Jindal.
It does have
Nikki
Bobby
Haley,
Jindal
they
and
were
Nikki
governors.
Haley, they're also there. But as your book points out, so one of the ways in which immigrants are changing the country is through politics, both Republican and Democratic politics. And so, what's the reaction been? I mean, are immigrants more readily accepted by white Southerners than blacks are? Why are people going there in such large numbers?
Oh, in terms of the politics?
Yeah, politics, and also just, there's tons of immigrants in Atlanta, in Houston, which is just a ridiculously multicultural city. So is it the case that, I mean, when an immigrant decides to come to America, the land of opportunity, how do they pick where to go? Is it where their people are, or is it where, there are jobs and or whether the weather is just nicer?
I think it's probably a combination of jobs and where the people are. Because, I mean, the case of the Indian group, Indians are the most highly educated group, right? Over 75% maybe have a BA or higher. So the Indian immigrants are very highly educated. So they're clearly going to places where they can get, there are jobs. Professionals. Many of them are in the computer fields, right? But once the community gets started, then it becomes more welcoming for others to come. I think so. I think both things are operating.
Right.
Yeah.
But I've also noticed tons of, North Carolina would fall apart if it weren't for Latinos. So all the landscapers, much of the agricultural workforce, people in pork processing, chicken processing, they're all Latinos. And there's this complex relationship among my neighbors there, and, people across the country, where they're like individual immigrants, but often in the southern states, there's this resistance to immigration in the abstract.
And particular immigrants, I would think. There is a lot of anti-Latino sentiment, a sense that, on the whole, and many Mexicans who are coming, and they do have lower levels of education. There's a feeling that they're undocumented, which is true. We haven't talked about it. There are about 11 million undocumented in the U.S., and about half of them are, more than that, over half, I should say, are either Mexican or other Latinos. But if you look at the Mexican population, most Mexicans are not undocumented, or most Latin American immigrants are not undocumented. So there's this stereotype, and they tend to be in low-wage jobs, or on the whole. So there's more antipathy, I would say, to Latinos than to Asian Americans. On the whole.
How do you think this will play out in the coming midterms? As you point out, in the last election, Trump increased his share of the Latino vote by some 10%. So, the Latino population, like the Asian American population, is also heterogeneous in its political affiliations. So, do you have any sense of how this...
that gets us into the alignments of immigrants with politics. On the one hand, yes, there is a lot of concern that you read in the newspapers about the Hispanic vote, right? That Trump got 10% more of the Hispanic vote in 2020, which was a surprise, of course, given his policies and his discourse, which was so anti-immigrant, right, and anti-Latino. And so the question is, are they going to? Is the Democratic Party going to lose them? Because initially, when the immigration began to really, take off, there were even projections that, well, this is a great boon for the Democratic Party. This is going to put the Democratic Party in power forever. The Republicans aren't getting. But that, of course, didn't happen. Although one can, and I do think there can be more defections of Hispanics from the Democratic Party. But on the whole, if we look at Hispanics and Asian Americans, and certainly blacks, they are very heavily Democratic. So we can't forget that so far. I don't think that's going to disappear. In the last 4 presidential elections, more than 2/3 of Asian Americans and Hispanics voted for the Democratic. Party. And the Democratic Party, what is it, 40% of those in a national poll who lean or identify Democratic were ethnic and racial minorities. So they are becoming actually a much more important base for the Democratic Party because their numbers are increasing because of immigration and because more children of immigrants are getting over 18 and they can vote. So I think it is a concern of the Democratic Party that they may lose some of the Hispanic vote because they need more and more of it, not less, if they're going to win elections. But, you know, and that's the challenge for the Democratic Party. I don't know how it's going to work out in the midterms. You know, the projections are not good for the Democrats. And it could be that many ethnic and racial minorities, whether they're Black, Hispanic, or Asian American, won't vote. We don't really know. And there is, you know, the Hispanic vote is, many of them are conservative on social issues like abortion, you know, have a kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality. So many of them actually, if they're non-immigrants themselves and have been here for many generations, are against immigration. So they're, you know, and as both Hispanics and Asian Americans become more economically successful, they sometimes become more conservative. We've seen that over time. So, you know, with other groups. So, you know, I don't have an answer as to what's going to happen. It is a concern, especially, as I said, for the Democrats. The Republicans don't really seem to be going, I mean, I don't know how they're going to run in the midterms, but from what I read, the immigration is going to be an issue. And, you know, does that hurt them with Latino and Asian American voters? Black voters are overwhelmingly Democratic. And of course, that's 85% or more voted for a Democrat in the presidential elections in the last 4. So they're very heavily Democratic. And of course, with Democrats, it's always to get good turnout in the black vote is the issue. So I know that it adds a complexity. And of course, we have, in terms of immigration influencing politics, it's how it's influencing whites, because the other big change in politics that has happened, not only because of, but certainly immigration is a huge factor, has been the movement of working class or non-college educated whites from the Democratic to the Republican Party. I mean, that's been, in 1980, more whites were Democratic than Republican, and now it's the other way around. And the figures very much show that the defection of non-educated non-college educated whites from the Republican Party, and over these anti-immigrant sentiments and racial resentment.
You have a chapter on culture, and I found this passage really delightful. You write, ethnic minorities are more visible than they were in an earlier era when movie stars with Jewish and Italian immigrant origins typically changed their names to hide their ethnicity. And the themes of the films they starred in rarely had anything to do with their ethnic roots. Think, for example, of Lauren Bacall, born Betty Joan Persky, Tony Curtis, Bernard Schwartz, Kirk Douglas, Isur Danielovich Dembski, Dean Martin, Dino Paul Crocetti, Anne Bancroft, Anna Maria Luisa Italiano. That's fantastic. And you said this pattern of name changing has not altogether disappeared. Natalie Portman was born Natalie Hirschlag, Charlie Sheen was Carlos Irwin Estevez, and Nicolas Cage was Nicolas Coppola. But there's few people changing their names now, and you write about Kunal Nanjiani and the Big Sick. So tell us a bit about how the immigrants are influencing culture here, American culture, whatever that means, in movies, in food, in music, in literature.
Yes, they have, and they don't all have to change their. I mean, the other thing is that the U.S. is a very different place than it was in the 1950s or 40s or 30s, right? In terms of views of ethnicity, and of course, there's a notion of ethnic pride and not being, in fact, ashamed of your parents because they were immigrants. So I think there's a different attitude toward that. So there's, and the stars, what are the studios are not requiring people to change their names. It's had a huge influence. Yes, immigrants have had a huge influence on our culture, as they always have, but of course in a different way today. Everyone points to salsa, right? Outselling ketchup, right? We tacos, burritos we all eat, but pita bread. I mean, American diet, you go into a grocery store or a supermarket, you can see it. High-end restaurants, the food that, I think immigration has really changed our diet, improved it as it has in the past, right? We can be grateful for immigrants for improving the foods we eat. Music is very visible, actually. I mean, one of the interesting things is that a lot of Americans think that hip-hop, which is obviously a major part of popular music, was an African-American creation. And although African-Americans were involved, it was really as much a Latino and Afro-Caribbean creation. In fact, some of the biggest stars are from the Caribbean. You mentioned The Big Sick. Yes, immigrants are having an impact on movies that we see, certainly on novels. I mean, I think that's actually kind of amazing. If you look at the New York Times book review section every week, you're likely to see either an immigrant memoir or a novel by an immigrant author. And although, some of the themes that they write about are similar, the problems of adapting to life in America, intergenerational conflicts, some of them are also new and have to do with the culture and problems that present-day immigrants are having. So I think they've had a huge... and the events, right? Here we are in New York, right? And the largest public festival in New York is the West Indian American Day Parade, which is actually maybe the largest public festival in the country, on Eastern Parkway every Labor Day. And, the celebrations of Cinco de Mayo, which has become a staple in many cities all around the country, and not under Trump, but under Democratic presidents recently. Actually, the person who introduced it, I should say, was George Bush. George W. Bush held the first Cinco de Mayo celebration in the White House, in which he invited Mexican dignitaries, and that's been followed through. So here it's not just become a Cinco de Mayo celebration in the U.S. all over, but even in the White House. And I should say, as with many celebrations and as with many arts, they are not exactly like they were in the home country, and they are mixtures that develop here. I mean, the Cinco de Mayo is a good example because that's not a major holiday in Mexico. It is in one state, Puebla. It celebrates the victory of Mexicans in a military victory. And in most of Mexico, it's a very minor holiday. Whereas here, it's become a big holiday, and also it has to do with Mexican heritage. I mean, they're not celebrating a military victory. And also it's taken on American, they have drinks, they have carnival rides. I mean, it's taken on an American dimension. And even the West Indian Day Parade that I mentioned, that was my first research, was in Jamaica. They don't have a West Indian. They don't have, that doesn't exist there. This is a Trinidadian custom. And it's not held on Labor Day either. It's held, around Lent. And so it's morphed and changed and it's both an ethnic holiday and has elements from the home countries or home country region, but also changed in the U.S. So that's another, and of course we should be very grateful in all these ways to immigrants for enriching our culture.
You write about the differences between immigration to the U.S. and immigration to Europe, and these figures are really astounding, particularly about Muslim immigrants to Europe, that 40% of all immigrants from outside the European Union coming into the EU are Muslim. And in the US, Muslims are an estimated 4 to 5% of all immigrants. So, what are the differing perceptions of immigrants in Europe and here, and particularly with regard to Muslims?
Well, I think in Europe, much of the antipathy, hostility toward immigrants is toward Muslim immigrants, and that's what people are thinking of. I mean, now there are black immigrants. They also receive there's racist sentiments against black immigrants, although I should say many of the black immigrants are themselves Muslims, because they come from Muslim countries in Africa. But that is the big issue about immigration in Europe has to do with Muslim immigrants. You saw that recently in the French election. I mean, the discussion on Le Pen. I mean, you know, it was all about Muslims, and even though there is anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States, that is, and Donald Trump, of course, talked about that. I don't think that's, when people think about immigrants, I don't think they think automatically Muslim immigrants. I think they actually mainly think Latino immigrants, and they also mainly think undocumented immigrants, and they're not Muslims. I mean, Muslims also coming to the U.S. have much higher, they're middle class, many of them. They're from a whole range of different countries. I think, so I think, you know, that it's a big, that is the fault line for immigration in Europe is about Muslims, and I don't think that's not true here.
The book, I mean, it's a hopeful book, but it ends on this really lovely, hopeful note, and I'm going to read this passage you have. You say, for more and more Americans, interacting with people of different races and ethnicities in schools, workplaces, religious congregations and local communities will be a normal, commonplace feature of everyday life. This does not mean that racial prejudice and discrimination and race-based inequalities will disappear. They will not. But there is every indication that increased social contacts among those of similar social status from different racial and ethnic backgrounds will reduce prejudice, as well as foster less conflict-ridden, indeed often amicable and sometimes even intimate relations. So this is a really lovely vision of the country.
Well, we shouldn't be, I don't want to be Pollyannish here, but I think there is a lot of evidence in that. And then to end on, maybe to talk about, just to mention, I mean, the enormous growth in mixed unions and multiracial children. In, 2015, 1 out of 6 new marriages that occurred in that year were between people of different races and ethnicities, mainly a white person and a non-white person. And in 2017, 1 out of 10 infants who were born in that year had a minority and white parent. So it's not just, yes, I think that people from different backgrounds are going to be interacting, but also there are going to be people who themselves are the product of these mixed unions. And although that doesn't, again, guarantee, you know, we don't know how they will be viewed by others or how they'll see themselves, I think, but I think that means that's going to lead to, I think that will be increasing, because we know that if we look at the younger cohorts in this country, they are increasingly ethnic and racial minorities, who we call ethnic and racial minorities, and that may not even be true, right? We may not think that way. So, you know, I often say, you know, if here we are in an apartment, right, the Tenement Museum, and you go back to the Lower East Side, and, you know, people thought, you know, that Jews would never assimilate, that they were going to pollute America's racial stock, that they were, the same thing with Italians. If you had told someone then that, you know, Jews and Italians would be thought of in pretty much the same way that other, quote, white people were thought of, they would say, never, that's never going to happen, right? So we don't know, and that did happen, right? I mean, so I think that we can't really look ahead 100 years and know what's going to happen, but we certainly shouldn't assume that it's going to be exactly the same as it is now. And I think that's another way to end on, you know, to say that immigration changes America, because it changes our perceptions of race and difference and ethnicity.
It really is the great thing about America, right? It's a country made up of all the other countries. We have time for questions from the audience.
Yes, we will take questions from the audience. I'm going to pass it back to our in-person audience first before we look to see if we have any comments online.
Thank you so much. I guess my question is, in some ways, an unanswerable question, but given all of the studies and all that you draw on that shows, right, chapter by chapter, whether you're talking about economics or culture, that this immigration post-1965 has impacted the nation in a very positive way that's quantifiable. So given that, why are we facing an election cycle, midterms, right, where the same rhetoric will come up? And if we can't counter that with the facts, what is it that we can do? Is it that someone needs to write a counter history, like if there hadn't been the 1965 immigration law, right, and we didn't have this, you know, where might we be as a country without immigration? I realize I'm asking an unanswerable question, but curious to hear, given all the time that both of you have spent with this material and people across the country, curious to hear your thoughts on that and what we can do about it.
Well, I guess, you know, first of all, you know, most Americans actually are rather positive about immigration. It's the ones who are negative about it and who are Republicans. I mean, because that's what's happening. It's a political issue. And the Republicans see this as a way to get out their base. And that's what they're doing. And they see this as a winning issue for them. And that's because of the appeal to racial resentment, the appeal to this, you know, fear that immigration is going to further undermine the position of whites who are already having very great difficulty economically, right, and making it, and you know, getting ill, and I mean they blame immigrants who they see as they believe they're being favored, and they believe that they're also going to take over America, you know, that their numbers are going to, you know, outpace those of whites, and that they're going to get the advantages that the government has, you know, is going to give them, and they're going to lose out. And they find the appeals of the Republican Party appealing. And that, I mean, how do you stop the Republicans from I mean, in a way, it's a feedback loop in a way, right? But, you know, so I don't, you know, do I see the Republicans changing their tune? In some ways, that's the issue, because the Democrats are not doing that. So the question is, maybe, I have some in the book I talk about, well, maybe the Republicans will feel that they need to get more of the ethnic minority vote. And so then maybe they will, and also they begin to run more candidates. They do run some candidates, we know. I mean, look, well, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, he's one of the worst, right? I mean, but okay, you know, that they're children of immigrants. Maybe that will help to change things. But then you look at some of the demographics, and non-college educated whites will be a considerable chunk of the electorate for a while. They vote. And the most conservative and racist ones of them, to use that phrase, are the ones who are most likely to come out in the primaries, right? Tomorrow there's the primary in Ohio. So that's the problem, I think. The Democratic Party is very inclusive. Watch their conventions. I mean, they talk about immigration being wonderful for this country, right? They talk about inclusion of people of different races and ethnicities. They're not saying that. And so that's the problem. I mean, I think that's the issue. And talking about, you know, that immigration is good and great for America, I don't think that's going to change the views of very conservative, pro-Trump Republicans. I don't think so. I don't know how you change their minds, but I'm not. I mean, maybe, you know, that's the big debate in the Democratic Party. How do you do that, right? Do you talk about the kinds of programs that we're going to have to improve your lives? Do you get it equally? I mean, after all, the Republicans are very aggressive and in your face and nasty, right? And the Democrats tend not to do that too much. Should they be more nasty? I don't know. I'm just raising. I mean, these are really political issues that I see. I don't know, Suketu, if you want to add to that.
Well, so much of it is just narrative, and, you know, the single biggest personality driving hatred of immigrants in this country is Tucker Carlson.
Yes.
Just night after night, and you know, there's he has a huge support base, and there's also, he's well financed. He's making money for Fox News, so there's money in hate, and you know, the narrative of immigration. I think you're completely right. Most Americans have a positive view of immigration, and even some of the non-college educated whites, if you picture them, it's, oh yeah, my grandfather came over from Italy or Ireland or wherever But he wasn't like these guys. He worked hard. He didn't come here to steal and to take. So it's about storytelling.
Yeah, it's the well, and Tucker Carlson with the replacement theory, which is another one that's the same theme, that they're coming and they're going to replace us, and even that they're coming in especially to vote illegally, right, in the United States. I mean, that's what he's been, and he has a huge audience. So that's depressing. Yeah.
I wonder, sort of similar, not really an answerable question, I guess, but I was thinking about, I've been reading so much lately about how concerned certain countries are, like China and Japan, with the aging population and declining fertility, and how that is going to impact their economies in not that far future, and how their governments are really trying to figure out how to get out ahead of that. And I think immigration is a huge part of why we are economically competitive, and always has been a huge part of our advantage in so many ways, culturally, but also economically. So I wonder if there's a way to talk about that, to make that sort of more of a viable argument in politics.
Well, I think it is a viable. I don't know how much it will appeal to people and bring them over to the Democratic Party, but clearly it's going to be a factor that you've mentioned. Those points are going to lead to more immigration, because we know the baby boomers are aging, and again, a figure in 2030, every baby boomer will be 65 or older. They're retiring from the workforce, and if you look at the cohorts below them, they're not as large. And so who's going to do the jobs, and who's going to pay into Social Security? We have a pay-as-you-go system to provide Social Security payments, and on top of this, we have declining fertility. We're not at replacement level. The U.S. used to be, but it's not anymore. So there's going to be a demand, actually, from employers for workers at all levels, and there's going to be pressure to have more immigration. Now, how it will be organized, I mean, Congress has not passed an immigration bill in a very long time. It seems to be impossible to get anything through Congress on immigration. But there's, how is the country going to deal with this? We've actually continued to receive large numbers of immigrants. Between 2001 and 2019, in almost every year, the U.S. has admitted almost 1 million or more immigrants. So there has been a continued inflow, despite what people think, and even under Donald Trump, except for the last year. So I think we will have more immigrants. Japan is an interesting case, because they did not want immigrants, but they are now, they want immigrants, because a lot of countries are having this demographic problem. And to the extent that if Trump was trying to cut down on immigration really greatly, I mean, if I don't know what would happen in after the next presidential election, and if there'll be more attempts to cut down on immigration, but I think there'll be counter pressures from employers, and some way where maybe it'll be more temporary immigration, but then we know from certainly the Europe case that temporary migrants often become permanent. They stay beyond their period, that they're allowed to stay, they become undocumented. So then you just increase the undocumented population. So anyway, you raise really good points. But I don't know how much that would motivate, again, people to change their political views in terms of immigration.
We have one last question, I think, from our online audience before I turn it over to you all for final thoughts. And they asked the question of, can you illuminate your research process for this book? What were the sources that you turned to?
My goodness,
to create this book?
Oh, okay. Well, there is a vast literature out there. Scholars have been busy working on this in many different fields. So I looked at what other people have written. I looked at quantitative data, census data, survey data that has been collected. I drew on some of my own research on immigration, because I've been writing about immigration now for several decades, and colleagues, and so I think it's pulling together of really a rather vast amount of material to tell this story. I mean, for example, if we look at New York, there's literature on New York. Now, I tried to actually not write that much about New York in this book, because I had to go beyond that. But there's material for different cities that you can find, and so that's really, it was an interpretive synthesis, I think is how it's called. So I synthesized a lot of material that was out there, and qualitative studies also, people's interviews, novels,
To end, Nancy, can we go back to the beginning?
Yes.
So you and I are both Queens people, as was Donald Trump. He grew up in Jamaica Estates when it was an all-white luxury enclave, and Jamaica Estates is now full of actual Jamaicans from Jamaica, and there are also Bangladeshis. And you write a bit about the queens of your childhood changing. The queens of my childhood keeps changing, but it was changing when I got there in 1977. Talk a bit about your.
Yes, it sort of
coming up in New York.
encapsulates a lot of the things that we've been talking about, because I grew up, I guess, for those of New Yorkers who know, on the border of kind of Flushing and Bayside. And it was a neighborhood when I was growing up, it was 100% white. It was the children and grandchildren of Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants who moved there for the nicer houses and the backyards and the better schools. And it was totally white. Today, that neighborhood, I went and looked up the statistics, of course, and they're asking how I did this. I went to look up the census figures. It's 50% Asian American, 10% Hispanic, and non-Hispanic whites are now 30%. That's an enormous change. I mean, I'm not that old. This was in the 50s and 60s that I was there. But that's a tremendous transformation of a neighborhood. And it really does, in a way. I mean, after we've talked about rural areas being affected, but New York City has been enormously affected by immigration and changed. There are over 3 million immigrants in New York now. That's 3 times as many practically as were here in 1970. So the numbers here have grown, and they've come from, all over the world, really all over the world, in large numbers, from Asia, Africa, Latin America, you name it, Europe still. I mean, New York has become so much more diverse, and the communities in New York, like my own neighborhood that I grew up in, it would be really unrecognizable today. And so maybe it's my own biography, right, in terms of looking back and how immigration has changed New York. And it may be just another little sentence, because many times I've written in the past so much about New York and immigration to New York, and I often wrote about how immigration changed the immigrants in New York. I was particularly interested. And every once in a while I would get a question and it would say, well, how has New York changed? And actually that was in the back of my mind when I started to write this book. Because I said, I didn't write a book about how New York has changed. I mentioned it along the way in things that I wrote. But it made me think that I really should look at how America has changed as a result of immigration. Not just how immigrants are changed, which is obviously tremendously important. We want to know how immigrants have changed and how their children have changed. That's obviously critical. But we also want to know, just as important, is how the U.S. has changed and how the cities have changed, like my neighborhood in Queens. So maybe I should do a study and go back to my neighborhood. I don't live there anymore, right? To go back and move into my neighborhood and be like an anthropologist and live there. But I think this is happening all over the country. And so I think it's exciting and really interesting, and I think important to understand if we're going to understand this country.
I think you should write that book next. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk and for writing this book, which I learned so much from about my people.
Thank you so much and for the conversation. And thank you to the Tenement Museum for having me.
All right.
Okay.